both keeping short-term market rates stable and in line with bank rate and undertaking a targeted amount of asset purchases, which are financed by the creation of central bank reserves. So basically, if you can read between all the lines there, that's actually admitting that what we are accusing the bank of doing, not actually giving up anything of lawful consideration and having no rightful claimed interest, they're actually confirming that that's true. That's written in the lines right there. But certainly, this is no direct answer to our questions, you see. It's claiming the opposite. It's claiming that it's delivering monetary stability in this way. And so it goes on with a bunch of jargon, which, you have to exercise an IQ of 200 to see through all this stuff, unless you understand this obfuscation of the currency and you know that these guys are just BS in their way through all this. And the reason that they are is the thing that's so important for us to understand, because the reason they are is because they don't have an argument which can prevail. This is why when we protest, we can't go out and say, oh, we're not complying with the system, or we're not participating in the system for a week. I'm sorry. All that happens is you accumulate further indebtedness. Your bills come due. You don't produce to keep up with them. The worst thing about that, and I mean, I'm not saying don't protest. I'm saying, why protest against something which doesn't even accomplish anything or for it when you have solution? And your signs could read, they could read people for mathematically perfected economy. They could read falsification of indebtedness to a purported banking system which gives up no lawful consideration, inherently engenders terminal failure. Can read anything I've said about this banking system, and those would be signs to read. Those would be signs that as you protest and parade around, people would see that you knew what you were talking about. There is one problem, one solution. Your signs could read one problem, period. One solution, period. There's all these movements going on, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them in particular here momentarily. But they're asking for things. One that I want to talk about is just precipitates out of a debate yesterday in a Facebook forum. I was asked to join because people wanted me to rescue them with fuller answers for the issues. But they're advocating a resource-based currency. And we have to understand what these alternatives amount to. How do they work? We can't just dream that, oh, that sounds good. That ought to work. How? I mean, we just splinter off in 1,000 different directions. Every Johnny-come-lately comes up with another idea that sounds good because they were talking about it in their yoga class or whatever, and all of a sudden it's a new monetary theory. Reserve-based currency. I've been hearing about these things for 40 years. Energy-based currency. Can you imagine that? Energy-based currency. How do you even possibly use it? The people that were advocating it to me practically every day never could explain once how to implement it even. Well, they thought they could, but all the holes you'd poke into it, they had no answers for them. An accountable proposition accounts for every doubt you can possibly have. That's the only thing that can serve us. These people aren't even identifying the problem, much less then can they develop that identification into a solution. So the other page, and I just soon you just go ahead and read these yourself, is how monetary policy works. It says, okay, from interest rates to inflation. And it provides a chart with a bunch of titles, and these, without any explanation, supposedly account for inflation. Now, it doesn't even say if it's circulatory inflation or price inflation, and we've proved over and over and over again, circulatory inflation can't even exist where you merely collateralize debts, nor does it exist where the circulation is less than the remaining value of all representable property. And it's far, 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 far less than that. So how could we possibly be suffering from circulatory inflation? Moreover, in regard to price inflation, we've proven over and over and over again that price inflation is caused by interest. So the subtitle of this, How Monetary Policy Works, which doesn't even explain how money is monetized, because if it did, it would answer those 4 questions, you know. Instead, it says from interest rates to inflation, okay. It says, when the Bank of England changes the official interest rate, it is attempting to influence the overall level of expenditure in the economy. Well, you know, it certainly does, and that's what the cause of price inflation is, because interest regulates the rate at which debt is multiplied. The higher the rates of interest, the more interest you have to borrow back into circulation to maintain a vital circulation. So you're accumulating further debt at a faster rate of greater sums of periodic interest on the debt. You know, so, but that's kind language which doesn't possibly reveal the crime to you, of course, because that's the purpose of the banking system. So this is why we're awry. I mean, people are constantly writing me every day, appeal to this politician, appeal to that politician. As I said, just, you know, a few days ago, beginning of this week, you know, we wrote a top politician in Greece. Not a word from him. I've sent 2 letters already. He's received a pile of telephone calls. Not a word in return. And this is somebody that, you know, a complimentary article is written that, you know, portrays this man as a person of principle who realizes the wrongs. But article also shows he doesn't have an answer. He's like ripe to be told, to be explained what this problem is. We could rescue Greece in a heartbeat. If we really, really wanted to do that. We can rescue every country in the world in a heartbeat if the people want to stand up against the obfuscation of the currency. But if we would want to discredit ourselves by claiming that we somehow are abstaining from the system by staying home for a week, I'm sorry. You know, I give you my blessing that you're at least protesting, but in truth, that's division. Why? Because you could have signs if you were protesting. You could show that you understand the problem and that you're not going to be denied solution. If you think that you can just sit off to the side and it's not happening to you, I'm sorry. It still is, you see. And so this idea itself discredits us because it leads others to see that, you know, we're basically nuts. We think that we can stand off to the side and our rent isn't going to be due. Our mortgage isn't going to accumulate. Payments aren't going to become due on it. That we aren't going to be further behind on foreclosure. That somehow the sum of debt isn't going to escalate. Just because we didn't borrow it back into circulation doesn't mean somebody else doesn't have to. Because if it's there, ladies and gentlemen, it was borrowed back into circulation. We're paying a phenomenal sum of principal and interest out of circulation in the terminal stages of this ever unascended system. You see? And that all has to come back into circulation. And how is it? By federal overspending. You know, it's already a terminal sum of debt. And then, you know, in the United Kingdom, they're going to force people to pay it down. You know, to truly pay it down, to actual austerity is impossible. You're immediately bankrupt if you try, you know, to any credible degree. Because the system can only multiply artificial indebtedness faster even than we can possibly create new industry in a system deprived of a free cent to do so by terminal indebtedness. It's a done deal, unless we change the system. So this goes on as well, purportedly explaining how monetary policy works and why and how they set interest rate. And it's a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo, which basically doesn't justify interest rates, or interest, but pretends to, as if they're a wholly natural thing. There's no discussion of whether there's a justification for interest. We just jump to the fact that, well, no one would loan us money if they weren't subject to interest. But to understand the cycle of money and whether or not it is ever the property of banks, we have to start at the beginning of money. How does it come into circulation? It only comes into circulation when we issue a promissory obligation. The banks merely publish evidence of that promissory obligation. They publish a representation of our promissory obligation, which we call money, rightly, but which is not a debt to the bank because the bank never gave up lawful consideration. There isn't a word in either of these pages how the banks gave up lawful consideration. There isn't a word how the banks do claim there's a debt to the bank, which he didn't even answer to us, and that's an obvious answer. Excuse me. That's an obvious answer. 7-year-old can answer that with the most rudimentary knowledge of economy. A second grader can answer that question. The banks do claim a debt to the banking system, but they never give up lawful consideration. And you read either of these two pages that this gentleman cites, if I may call him that, because it's at his hand that people are being dispossessed of their homes, their businesses, they're going bankrupt, they're suffering foreclosure. 125,000 children under the ages of 12 are homeless in just the streets of Los Angeles. It's the hands of people like this who know they're wrong, or he would have given the answers to us. So we have nothing but evasion here, and of course I was asked to draft the original questions, and likewise I was asked to draft a response to the bank. This isn't exactly my response, I believe. At least Mark added the initial sentence to it. And so the letter reads, 29th of July 2011, from Mark Lee of the Giles family. Dear Mr. Norman, sorry for the late reply. I've been away on business for a number of weeks, but just to touch base, quite remarkably, neither of the two, this is now we get into what I drafted as a response here. He says, quite remarkably, neither of the two pages which you cited can even be reached from the URLs your PDF provides. Assuming that in the first link this is a consequence of your misspelling of both sterling and monetary policy, and recognizing that in the second case you have again misspelled monetary policy, we therefore have corrected these errors to refer to the following two pages, that we may respond to your evasion of our questions. So the two rectified links are presented below this paragraph, and you can access the two pages best then from our response to the bank. Please send intended URLs if these are not the pages you would claim answer our questions. While these logical corrections would concur only with the corresponding URLs, we assume, however, despite their unaccountable content, that you are perfectly aware that neither of your cited pages even provides the scantest hint how the purported Bank of England, in fact, could give up anything of value equivalent to the debt the bank does claim to create to itself when it purports to create money. We're calling him out on his lie. An entirely unequivocal, conclusive answer to our first question, of course, would be incumbent upon any purported banking system or government, which nonetheless pretends to serve the subject people, for the natural, lawful, and legitimate cycle of promissory obligations is of course far different than the